What if I told you that one man once controlled nearly every drop of oil that powered America? That a single individual held the economic fate of an entire nation in his hands, dictating who would succeed and who would be crushed into oblivion. His name was not whispered in back rooms. It was spoken with fear in boardrooms from New York to San Francisco. John Davison Rockefeller. To the public, he was the pious Baptist who built universities and funded medical research. To his competitors, he was something else entirely. A calculating predator who destroyed lives without hesitation, who weaponized capitalism itself into an instrument of absolute domination. By 1904, Rockefeller controlled 91% of oil refining in the United States. 91%. His company, Standard Oil, was not just a business. It was an empire that operated above the law, beneath public scrutiny, and through a labyrinth of shell corporations designed to hide the hand that moved every piece on the board. He owned the railroads that transported oil. He owned the pipelines that carried it. He owned the politicians who were supposed to regulate him. And when someone dared to compete, he didn't just defeat them, he erased them from existence. This is not the story they teach in business schools, where Rockefeller is sanitized into a lesson about efficiency and innovation. This is the story buried in forgotten testimonies, in the tears of ruined men, in the documents that reveal how one man bent an entire nation to his will. Because John D. Rockefeller didn't just build a fortune, he built a machine designed to devour everything in its path. And for nearly half a century, that machine ran unchecked, reshaping America in its image, while his creator smiled from behind his Baptist hymnal, playing the saint while perfecting the art of corporate warfare. The question is not whether Rockefeller was brilliant. Everyone agrees he was. The question is whether genius excuses ruthlessness, whether progress justifies destruction, whether the ends can ever truly justify the means. By the time you finish this story, you'll understand why some called him the greatest businessman in history, and why others called him the most dangerous man in America. Both were right. The year is 1865. The American Civil War has just ended, leaving behind 600,000 corpses and a nation fractured beyond recognition. But from that blood-soaked soil, something unexpected begins to grow. An industrial revolution so explosive, so transformative, that it will reshape human civilization itself. The United States, once an agricultural backwater, is about to become an industrial colossus. And into this chaos steps a generation of men who will be remembered not as heroes, but as robber barons, titans who built empires on the backs of workers and the corpses of competitors. Mark Twain will name this era the Gilded Age, and the name will stick precisely because of its bitter irony. Gilded, not golden, a thin layer of beauty covering rot beneath. In the great cities, New York, Chicago, Cleveland, opulent mansions rise alongside festering slums. Millionaires dine on oysters and champagne, while immigrant children labor 14 hours a day in factories, where losing a finger is considered a minor inconvenience. There are no labor laws, no safety regulations, no income taxes for the wealthy. It is capitalism in its purest, most savage form. Survival of the fittest, dressed in a top hat and tails. Into this world of limitless opportunity and unchecked greed, a new resource emerges that will become more valuable than gold. In 1859, Edwin Drake strikes oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and suddenly the Pennsylvania hills are swarming with speculators, dreamers, and con men. They call it black gold, liquid sunshine, the fuel of the future. Crude oil, once considered a nuisance that contaminated water wells, is now refined into kerosene that lights America's lamps. Within a decade, oil will touch every aspect of American life. And within 2 decades, one man will control almost all of it. Cleveland, Ohio, 1863. A bustling port city on the shores of Lake Erie, positioned perfectly between the oil fields of Pennsylvania and the markets of the East. Here, a young bookkeeper named John Davison Rockefeller opens his first oil refinery. He is 24 years old, rail thin, with penetrating blue eyes that seem to calculate the worth of everything they see. Nobody knows his name yet. Nobody realizes they are witnessing the birth of something that will grow into a monster so powerful that it will take the full force of the United States government to bring it down. But Rockefeller is patient. He does not chase quick riches like the wildcatters in Pennsylvania who strike oil one day and go bust the next. He understands something they don't. The real money is not in drilling for oil, but in refining it, transporting it, controlling every step between the ground and the consumer. While others gamble on wells, Rockefeller builds an infrastructure. While others compete, he eliminates competition. While others play the game, he rewrites the rules. The stage is set. The players are in position. And what follows is not just a business story. It is a masterclass in power, a blueprint for domination that corporations still study today, and a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition meets opportunity in a world with no limits. Now, before we dive deeper into this empire of oil and shadow, take a moment and comment below. What city are you watching from today? Because chances are John D. Rockefeller's influence reached there too. Through the kerosene that lit your great-grandparents' lamps? Through the gasoline that powered the first automobiles? Through the very structure of modern capitalism itself. His shadow is longer than you think. The boy who would become the richest man in history was born into poverty and shame. July 8, 1839, in Richford, New York, a nothing town in the Finger Lakes region where farms struggled against rocky soil and harsh winters. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a con man who called himself a doctor despite having no medical training. Devil Bill, they called him, and the name fit. He sold patent medicines and miracle cures to desperate people, then disappeared for months at a time, leaving his wife Eliza and their children to wonder if he was dead or simply gone. But William Avery Rockefeller's greatest con was the one he played on his own family. For years, he maintained a secret second life a second family under the assumed name of Dr. William Livingston. He was a bigamist, a liar, and a thief. Young John Davison learned to read the world through the lens of his father's absences and his mother's desperate prayers. Eliza Davison Rockefeller was a devout Baptist, severe and pious, who taught her children that idleness was sin and that every penny was a gift from God to be stewarded with absolute discipline. The duality would define John forever. His father's ruthless pragmatism mixed with his mother's religious righteousness, creating a man who could destroy competitors on Monday and teach Sunday school on the weekend without seeing any contradiction. At 7 years old, John raised turkeys and sold them to neighbors, meticulously recording every transaction in a small ledger. He loaned money to neighbors at 7% interest, collecting payment with the precision of a much older man. His mother praised his discipline. His father taught him a darker lesson. "I cheat my boys every chance I get," Devil Bill once said. "I want to make 'em sharp." In 1853, the family moved to Cleveland, a city exploding with possibility as railroads connected the Great Lakes to eastern markets. At 16, John landed his first real job as an assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuvell, a produce commission firm. He earned 50 cents a day and treated the position as if it were a calling from God himself. He arrived early, stayed late, and filled ledger after ledger with numbers that balanced to the penny. His bosses noticed the intensity, the almost religious devotion to accuracy. But they also noticed something unsettling, the cold precision in those blue eyes, the way he seemed to view every human interaction as a transaction to be optimized. By 1859, at just 20 years old, Rockefeller had saved enough to form a partnership with Maurice Clark, an English immigrant. They dealt in grain, hay, and meats, commodity trading that taught Rockefeller the fundamentals of supply and demand, of buying low and selling high, of knowing when to hold and when to move. And then came 1861, and with it the Civil War that would kill hundreds of thousands, but make fortunes for men positioned to supply armies with food. Rockefeller and Clark made a killing selling provisions to the Union Army. While boys his age were dying at Gettysburg and Antitrust, John Davison Rockefeller paid $300 for a substitute to take his place in the draft, a perfectly legal practice for those who could afford it. He felt no shame about this. War was business, and business was war, and both demanded the same cold calculation. "I felt it was a great thing to let the other boys fight," he would say years later without irony. But grain was small thinking. In 1863, a man named Samuel Andrews approached Clark and Rockefeller with a proposition. Andrews had developed a more efficient process for refining crude oil into kerosene, and he needed capital. The partners invested, and suddenly they were in the oil business. Rockefeller visited the refinery and saw what others missed. The oil business was chaos. Hundreds of small refineries competing for crude, prices swinging wildly, fortunes made and lost in weeks. It was inefficient, wasteful, irrational. It was everything Rockefeller despised. He began attending auctions where crude oil was sold, studying the patterns, understanding the transportation costs, calculating margins with the precision that had defined him since childhood. And he realized something profound. Whoever controlled refining would control everything else. The drillers took all the risk: dry wells, fires, floods. But refineries, positioned correctly with reliable transportation, could weather any storm. All you needed was volume, efficiency, and the capital to outlast your competitors when prices dropped. In 1865, Rockefeller bought out Maurice Clark for $72,500, a fortune borrowed from banks who recognized something predatory and promising in the young man's eyes. The refinery became Rockefeller and Andrews. Within months, it was the largest refinery in Cleveland. Within 2 years, it was one of the largest in America. John D. Rockefeller was 28 years old, and he was just getting started. He worked 16-hour days, sleeping in a room above the refinery, waking to the smell of petroleum and possibility. He negotiated railroad rates with an intensity that made hardened businessmen uncomfortable. He studied every aspect of the refining process, identifying waste, improving efficiency, cutting costs to the bone. And he began to understand something that would define the rest of his life. In business, there was no such thing as enough. Every competitor was a threat. Every inefficiency was an insult. Every dollar left on the table was a sin against the God of profit. But one refinery, however efficient, was still just one refinery among hundreds. Rockefeller looked at the chaotic Cleveland refining landscape and saw something that needed correction. And correction, in his mind, meant consolidation. Total consolidation. Not partnership, absorption. Not cooperation, domination. The machine was learning how to devour, and it was hungry.
On January 10th, 1870, John D. Rockefeller, his brother William, Samuel Andrews, Henry Flagler, and Stephen Harkness gathered in Cleveland to sign the incorporation papers for a new company, Standard Oil of Ohio. The name was deliberate, carefully chosen. Standard implied reliability, quality, consistency, everything the chaotic oil industry lacked. The capitalization was $1 million, an enormous sum that signaled ambition beyond anything Cleveland had seen. But the number told only part of the story. The real genius lay not in the money, but in what Rockefeller planned to do with it. At 30 years old, Rockefeller had identified the central weakness of the oil industry: transportation. Crude oil had to move from Pennsylvania wells to refineries. Then, refined kerosene had to move from refineries to markets. The railroads controlled this movement, and they charged whatever rates the market would bear. Smaller refineries paid full price. But what if a refinery could promise volume, consistency, predictability? What if a refinery became so essential to a railroad's profit that the railroad had no choice but to negotiate? Rockefeller approached the 3 major railroads serving Cleveland: the Erie, the New York Central, and the Pennsylvania Railroad. He made them an offer that was brilliant in its simplicity and monstrous in its implications. Standard Oil would ship 60 carloads per day, guaranteed, in exchange for secret rebates, discounted rates that smaller competitors would never receive. But here was the truly diabolical part. Rockefeller also negotiated drawbacks, a kickback on every barrel his competitors shipped. Let that sink in. Every time a rival refinery shipped oil on these railroads, they paid full price, and Standard Oil received a percentage of that payment. The railroads agreed because the volume was irresistible. Rockefeller had weaponized the very infrastructure of capitalism against his competitors. And then he went further. In 1872, he orchestrated what would become known as the South Improvement Scheme, a secret alliance between major refiners and railroads designed to fix prices and eliminate competition entirely. The plan was exposed before it could be fully implemented, sparking outrage among independent oil producers and refiners. But by then, Rockefeller had learned what he needed to know. Coordination between transportation and refining could create unstoppable power. What happened next became legend in Cleveland business circles, spoken of in whispers and called by a name that captured its brutality: the Cleveland Massacre. Over the course of just 48 hours in February 1872, Rockefeller and Henry Flagler met with the owners of Cleveland's 22 remaining refineries. The pitch was simple and terrifying. Sell to Standard Oil at a price we determine, or be destroyed. Some were offered cash. Some were offered Standard Oil stock. All were shown the same ledgers that proved Standard Oil's transportation costs were half what the independents paid. The mathematics were undeniable. Independent refiners were paying $1.35 per barrel to ship oil to New York. Standard Oil paid 90 cents and received a 25-cent rebate on every barrel the independents shipped. The moment a competitor tried to undercut Standard Oil on price, Rockefeller could drop his price below cost and operate at a loss indefinitely, subsidized by his transportation advantages and vast capital reserves. The independents would bleed money until they collapse, at which point Standard Oil would acquire their assets for pennies on the dollar. One by one, the refiners signed. Some wept as they signed. Some raged. All capitulated. By the end of 1872, Standard Oil controlled 80% of Cleveland's refining capacity. But Rockefeller wasn't finished with Cleveland. He was finished with stopping at Cleveland. He turned his attention to the great refining centers of America: Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York City, Baltimore. In each city, the pattern repeated: secret railroad agreements, price wars that drove competitors to bankruptcy, acquisitions at fire sale prices.
The testimony of one ruined competitor, George Rice, captured the experience. I had built a small refinery in Marietta, Ohio. I was doing well until Rockefeller came. First, the railroad rates increased, but only for me. Then, merchants who bought my kerosene were told they would lose their credit if they continued. My banks called in my loans. Within 6 months, I had lost everything. When I confronted Rockefeller's agents, they offered me pennies for my property. I refused. They waited until the sheriff's sale and bought it anyway for even less. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity. 90%. It was a monopoly in everything but name, and Rockefeller had built it through a combination of genuine innovation and ruthless elimination of competition. The company refined oil more efficiently than anyone else. That part was true. Rockefeller's obsession with waste elimination meant Standard Oil captured byproducts that other refineries simply burned off. They made lubricants, paraffin wax, petroleum jelly, even paint and varnish from petroleum waste. The company was a model of vertical integration and efficiency. But efficiency alone doesn't explain how one company swallowed an entire industry. Henry Flagler, Rockefeller's right-hand man and co-architect of the transportation schemes, was famous for saying, "A friendship founded on business is a good deal better than a business founded on friendship." It was the philosophy of the operation. Everything was transactional, everything was negotiable, and loyalty meant nothing compared to advantage. John D. Archbold, another Standard Oil executive, was even more blunt. "We are not in business for our health, but for the dollars." Rockefeller himself maintained plausible deniability through a carefully cultivated public image. He attended church every Sunday at the Euclid Avenue Baptist Church in Cleveland, taught Sunday school, and tithed 10% of his income with meticulous precision. He gave money to schools and charities, always ensuring the donations were publicized. When accused of predatory practices, he responded with the calm self-righteousness of a man who believed God blessed those who created order from chaos. "The growth of a large business is merely a survival of the fittest," he said. "The American beauty rose can be produced in the splendor and fragrance which bring cheer to its beholder only by sacrificing the early buds which grow up around it." The early buds, his competitors, sacrificed. He said it plainly, and he meant it literally. But the truly terrifying thing about Rockefeller was not his ruthlessness. Plenty of men in the Gilded Age were ruthless. It was his patience, his methodical approach, his ability to construct systems that destroyed competition as efficiently as his refineries processed crude oil. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to create a machine that made losing impossible for anyone who challenged him. And he was succeeding beyond anyone's nightmares. But the machine he had built was still operating in the open, vulnerable to lawsuits and public outrage. What Rockefeller needed was a way to hide the machine's gears, to make his empire legally invisible while maintaining absolute control. He needed someone to invent a new kind of corporate structure, something that had never existed before. He needed to reinvent capitalism itself. And in 1882, he found the man who could do it, a brilliant, amoral lawyer named Samuel C. Dodd. The problem, as Samuel C.T. Dodd explained to Rockefeller in 1881, was visibility. Standard Oil's dominance had made it a target for politicians, prosecutors, and journalists. State legislatures were passing laws specifically designed to limit the company's power. Lawsuits were piling up. Public anger was growing. The company controlled the market, but it couldn't control the backlash. What Rockefeller needed was a structure that maintained his absolute control while diffusing legal liability and hiding the true extent of his empire from public view. Dodd was a former Pennsylvania judge who had joined Standard Oil as chief counsel, and he was about to earn every penny of his salary. On January 2, 1882, he presented Rockefeller with a legal innovation that would reshape American capitalism: the Standard Oil Trust. It was elegant, diabolical, and technically legal. Under the trust structure, the stockholders of 41 separate companies would transfer their shares to 9 trustees, who would manage all the companies as a single entity. The companies would appear independent on paper, each incorporated in different states to avoid anti-monopoly laws. But in reality, all decisions flowed from 26 Broadway in New York City, from a small group of men who reported to one person, John D. Rockefeller. The genius of the trust was its invisibility. A customer buying kerosene from one of Standard Oil's subsidiary companies had no idea they were actually buying from the same entity that controlled a dozen other competing brands. A state legislature trying to regulate Standard Oil in Ohio had no jurisdiction over the web of companies incorporated in New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. And when lawsuits targeted one subsidiary, the trust structure insulated the others. It was corporate camouflage perfected into an art form. But the trust was more than legal trickery. It represented vertical integration taken to its logical extreme. Standard Oil didn't just refine oil anymore. It controlled every stage of production. The company bought thousands of acres of timberland to produce its own barrels. It owned the plants that made sulfuric acid for refining. It built its own railroad tank cars and then built the railroad tracks to run them on. It owned the pipelines that carried crude from Pennsylvania and Ohio wells directly to refineries, bypassing the railroads entirely when advantageous. It owned the ships that transported kerosene to foreign markets. From the moment crude oil emerged from the ground to the instant a customer lit a lamp in Tokyo or London, Standard Oil controlled every dollar of value creation. The scale was unprecedented. By 1885, the trust operated 70 factories, produced 83 different petroleum products, and employed over 100,000 workers. Its annual revenue exceeded $200 million, more than the GDP of some countries. Rockefeller himself was now worth over $40 million, making him comfortably the richest private citizen in America. But money was never the point. Money was simply the measure of control, and control was what he worshipped.
To maintain that control, Standard Oil developed what today would be called corporate espionage into a systematic practice. The company maintained agents in every major market who reported on competitors' activities, their production volumes, their customers, their pricing, their vulnerabilities. If an independent refinery emerged, Standard Oil immediately investigated its financing, transportation contracts, and customer base. Then came the pressure campaign. Railroads would suddenly raise shipping rates for the independent while lowering them for Standard Oil. Merchants who bought from competitors would receive visits from Standard Oil salesmen, offering exclusive discounts, but only if they stopped buying from anyone else. Banks that extended credit to competitors found their own relationships with Standard Oil threatened. The testimony from the later antitrust trials revealed just how systematic this warfare was. One Standard Oil executive admitted under oath that the company maintained a policy of deliberately operating certain facilities at a loss in regions where competitors were active, subsidizing those losses with profits from monopoly regions until the competitors collapsed.
"We would rather sell kerosene at a loss for a year," one internal memo read, "than allow a competitor to establish a foothold that might threaten our position for the next 10 years." But the true genius, or evil, of the Standard Oil machine was that it made resistance economically irrational. A competitor who tried to undercut Standard Oil on price would trigger an immediate, devastating response. Standard Oil would drop prices in that market below the cost of production, operating at a loss that a smaller company couldn't sustain. The competitor had two choices: match the price and go bankrupt within months, or maintain prices and watch all their customers disappear. Either way, they lost. And once they collapsed, Standard Oil would acquire their assets, then raise prices back to monopoly levels. The pattern repeated in cities across America: competition, price war, acquisition, price increase. The Tidewater Pipeline Company learned this lesson painfully. In 1879, independent oil producers in Pennsylvania built a 110-mile pipeline from the oil fields to the Reading Railroad, bypassing Standard Oil's railroad monopoly entirely. It was a brilliant move, an engineering marvel, and a direct threat to Rockefeller's control. His response was methodical and crushing. Standard Oil agents bought land along the pipeline route and filed lawsuits claiming easement violations. They bribed railroad employees to accidentally damage pipeline equipment. They bought controlling interests in Tidewater's customers, then canceled contracts. And they built their own competing pipelines, selling transportation at a loss until Tidewater's investors, bleeding money, agreed to join Standard Oil rather than continue fighting.
The Pure Oil Company tried a different strategy. They appealed directly to the public, framing their resistance as a fight for independent business against monopoly. They published advertisements exposing Standard Oil's tactics. They lobbied state legislatures for protection. They built alliances with other independents. It worked, briefly. Pure Oil survived longer than most competitors, serving niche markets and maintaining a core of loyal customers. But Rockefeller played a longer game. He didn't destroy Pure Oil immediately. He isolated them, limited their growth, and waited. By the time the Antitrust case finally broke Standard Oil's monopoly in 1911, Pure Oil was a shell of what it might have been, proof that resistance was survival at best, never success. Through it all, Rockefeller maintained his public persona as a devout Christian and responsible businessman. Every Sunday, he appeared at church, his face serene, his manner humble. He gave carefully publicized donations to Baptist causes, to black colleges in the South, to medical research. In 1892, he founded the University of Chicago with an initial gift of $600,000, eventually donating over $80 million to the institution. The university became world-class, its research respected globally. But the money that built its laboratories and libraries came from the broken backs of ruined competitors and exploited workers, whose wages were kept deliberately low to maximize efficiency.
The duality was not hypocrisy to Rockefeller. It was coherence. He genuinely believed he was doing God's work by bringing order to chaos, by making American industry efficient and globally dominant, by creating wealth that could then be distributed through philanthropy to deserving causes. That some men were destroyed in the process was simply evidence of their unfitness for the modern age. "I believe the power to make money is a gift from God," he said in an interview. "It is my duty to make money and still more money, and to use the money I make for the good of my fellow man, according to the dictates of my conscience." His conscience apparently dictated an empire built on the systematic elimination of economic freedom for anyone who stood in his way. By 1890, Standard Oil was not just a monopoly, it was a template. Other industries watched and learned. Steel magnates like Andrew Carnegie, railroad barons like J.P. Morgan. They all saw what Rockefeller had achieved and understood the lesson. Consolidation was destiny, monopoly was efficiency, and the law was something to be navigated, not obeyed. The Gilded Age was in full bloom, and at its center sat a thin man with cold blue eyes, who controlled an empire so vast that even he couldn't fully comprehend its reach. But empires, however mighty, are never invulnerable. They contain within them the seeds of their own destruction, and Standard Oil's seeds were germinating in an unexpected place: the office of a woman named Ida Tarbell, who had personal reasons to hate John D. Rockefeller, and the investigative skills to turn that hatred into the most consequential piece of journalism in American history.
Her father had been one of the independent oilmen crushed in Standard Oil's rise, and Ida Minerva Tarbell never forgot watching her family's security evaporate under the weight of Rockefeller's machine. Born in 1857 in the Pennsylvania oil regions, she grew up surrounded by the boom and bust cycles of petroleum speculation. Her father, Frank Tarbell, had operated a small tank-building company until Standard Oil's consolidation drove him to the edge of bankruptcy. Young Ida watched him come home night after night, exhausted and defeated, talking about secret railroad rates and mysterious price drops that made honest business impossible. She was supposed to be invisible in the world of serious journalism. Women in the 1890s didn't investigate corporate malfeasance or take on the most powerful man in America. They wrote about fashion and society events, if they wrote at all. But Tarbell had studied biology at Allegheny College, worked as a teacher, and spent 8 years in Paris as a journalist, covering French culture and politics. She was 44 years old in 1902 when S.S. McClure, publisher of McClure's magazine, approached her with an assignment: write a series of articles about Standard Oil. McClure's was the flagship publication of what Theodore Roosevelt would soon derisively call muckraking journalism, investigative reporting that exposed corruption in business and politics. The magazine had already published explosive exposés on municipal corruption and patent medicine fraud. But taking on Standard Oil meant taking on an entity with virtually unlimited resources, an army of lawyers,
and a proven track record of destroying anyone who threatened its interests. Tarbell knew the risks. She accepted anyway. For 5 years, she conducted the most thorough investigation of a corporation ever attempted. She traveled to Cleveland, New York, Pennsylvania, interviewing former Standard Oil employees who spoke on condition of anonymity, terrified of retaliation. She obtained internal company documents that revealed the secret railroad agreements, the drawback schemes, the systematic campaigns to eliminate competitors. She interviewed the widows of ruined businessmen and read through thousands of pages of testimony from state investigations that had been buried or ignored. And she wrote with the clarity of someone who understood both the technical details of the oil industry and the human cost of monopoly. The first installment of The History of the Standard Oil Company appeared in McClure's magazine in November 1902. The impact was seismic. Tarbell didn't just accuse Standard Oil of unfair practices, she documented them with irrefutable evidence, naming names, reproducing internal documents, building a case so comprehensive that even Standard Oil's lawyers struggled to refute it. She described the South Improvement Scheme in detail, exposed the railroad rebate system, chronicled the Cleveland Massacre, and revealed how systematically Standard Oil had used its power to crush competition. But Tarbell did something even more devastating. She humanized the victims. She told the story of George Rice, the small refiner from Ohio, who fought Standard Oil for years before losing everything. She interviewed workers whose wages had been cut to maximize profits while Rockefeller donated millions to charity. She spoke to the families of men who had committed suicide after being driven out of business. And she did it all in prose that was both accessible and damning, turning economics into narrative, statistics into tragedy.
Over 19 installments. Published between 1902 and 1904, Tarbell systematically dismantled the mythology surrounding John D. Rockefeller. She acknowledged his organizational genius, his efficiency innovations, his genuine improvements to refining technology. But she showed that genius had been weaponized, efficiency had become brutality, and innovation had been used to create a monopoly that distorted the entire American economy. Mr. Rockefeller has systematically played with loaded dice, she wrote, and it is doubtful if there has been a time since 1872 when he has run a race with a competitor and started fair. Rockefeller's response revealed both his power and his weakness. Publicly, Standard Oil issued calm denials, claiming Tarbell was biased and that the company had simply been more efficient than its competitors. Privately, Rockefeller referred to her as Miss Tarbell and suggested she was a bitter old maid motivated by personal grievance rather than truth. His allies in friendly newspapers published attacks on her character, questioning her objectivity and implying that a woman couldn't possibly understand the complexities of business. But none of it worked. Tarbell had the documents. She had the testimony. She had built a case that survived every attack. The public reaction was explosive. Millions of Americans read the McClure series,
And suddenly, Standard Oil was no longer seen as a triumph of American industry, but as a threat to American democracy. Editorial cartoons depicted Standard Oil as an octopus with tentacles wrapped around government buildings, banks, and railroads. Politicians who had quietly accepted Standard Oil's campaign contributions suddenly discovered a taste for antitrust rhetoric. And Theodore Roosevelt, who had become president after McKinley's assassination in 1901, saw an opportunity to build his reputation as a trust buster. Roosevelt was no radical. He believed in capitalism and had no intention of destroying big business. But he also believed in limits, in the principle that no private entity should be powerful enough to threaten democratic governance. And Standard Oil, thanks to Tarbell's investigation, now represented everything Roosevelt claimed to oppose: concentrated power, corporate arrogance, the subordination of public good to private profit. In 1906, Roosevelt's Justice Department filed suit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, the federal law designed to prohibit monopolies and restraint of trade. The legal battle that followed would take 5 years and generate over 14,000 pages of testimony. But the outcome was never really in doubt. Ida Tarbell had already won the case in the court of public opinion. She had transformed Rockefeller from a respected businessman into a symbol of everything wrong with Gilded Age capitalism. And she had done it not through rhetoric or ideology, but through patient, methodical, irrefutable documentation of the truth. Years later, Tarbell would reflect on the investigation with characteristic precision. "I never had an animus against their size and wealth, never objected to their corporate form. I was willing that they should combine and grow as big and wealthy as they could, but only by legitimate means. But they had never played fair, and that ruined their greatness for me." She had exposed the machine. Now it was time to see if the machine could be stopped, or if it had grown too powerful to be dismantled even by the full weight of the United States government. The formal complaint filed by the Department of Justice on November 15, 1906, was 49 pages long and contained allegations that read like an indictment of capitalism itself: conspiracy to monopolize, restraint of trade, elimination of competition through predatory pricing, manipulation of transportation systems, corruption of public officials. The government named Standard Oil of New Jersey and 70 subsidiary companies as defendants, along with 7 individual executives, including John D. Rockefeller himself. The case was assigned to Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, a progressive reformer known for hostility to corporate power. Standard Oil's defense strategy was predictable and well-funded. The company hired the best corporate lawyers in America, men who specialized in finding technicalities and procedural delays. They argued that Standard Oil had succeeded through superior efficiency, that its size was the natural result of serving customers better than competitors, that the American economy had benefited immensely from the company's innovation and global reach. They were not wrong about some of this. Standard Oil had brought order to the chaotic early oil industry, standardized product quality, and made kerosene affordable for millions of families. But legal truth and technical truth are not always the same thing. And the Sherman Antitrust Act didn't care whether a monopoly was efficient. It cared whether a monopoly existed and whether it had been achieved through unfair means. The evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors introduced document after document showing secret railroad agreements, systematic underpricing in competitive markets, acquisitions of competitors under duress. They called witnesses who testified about being driven out of business by Standard Oil's predatory tactics. They showed that in markets where Standard Oil faced no competition, prices were significantly higher than in markets where independents still operated, proving that the company's efficiency claims were cover for monopolistic price manipulation. And then came the moment everyone had waited for: John D. Rockefeller's testimony. On July 6, 1908, the 71-year-old Rockefeller sat in the witness chair in a federal courtroom in New York City. He looked frail, almost grandfatherly, his face lined with age, but his blue eyes still sharp and calculating. The newspapers called it the trial of the century, and reporters filled every seat, their pencils ready to record every word from the man who had become both the most admired and most reviled businessman in American history. The government prosecutors had prepared meticulously. They had internal Standard Oil documents proving coordination between supposedly independent companies. They had testimony from ruined competitors. They had railroad records showing the secret rebate agreements. All they needed was for Rockefeller to confirm what the paper trail already proved, that he had personally directed the creation and maintenance of an illegal monopoly. But Rockefeller had not survived 5 decades of corporate warfare by being careless. His strategy was simple and maddeningly effective: claim ignorance. When asked about specific railroad agreements, he responded, "I don't remember." When confronted with documents bearing his signature, he said he couldn't recall the context. When pressed about decisions that clearly required his approval, he suggested that subordinates had acted without his knowledge. Over the course of 3 days of testimony, Rockefeller uttered variations of "I don't remember" or "I have no recollection" 72 times. The spectacle was both impressive and infuriating. Here sat a man who had once controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity, who had personally negotiated the deals that built Standard Oil into an empire, who was famous for his photographic memory when it came to financial details, and he claimed to remember almost nothing about the specific practices that had made him the richest man in the world. "I was occupied with the larger questions of the business," he explained with practiced humility. "The details were managed by capable subordinates whom I trusted implicitly."
The prosecutors hammered him with specifics. How had Standard Oil acquired 41 companies in just 2 years during the 1870s? "Through fair negotiation," Rockefeller responded. But the documents showed that many of those negotiations had involved threats to destroy competitors through price wars if they didn't sell. Did Standard Oil use its railroad agreements to gain unfair advantage? We simply negotiated better terms due to our volume, he claimed, omitting that those terms included drawbacks on competitors' shipments. Did the company operate at a loss in certain markets to eliminate competition? I have no personal knowledge of such practices, and if they occurred, they were not company policy. It was a masterclass in evasion, and it enraged Judge Landis, who at one point interrupted to say, "Mr. Rockefeller, this court finds it difficult to believe that a man of your well-known business acumen could be so remarkably uninformed about the operations of a company you founded and controlled." Rockefeller simply nodded and repeated that he had focused on strategy while delegating operational details. The implication was clear. Even if illegal acts had occurred, they couldn't be directly tied to him personally. He was insulated by layers of corporate structure and plausible deniability. But the government didn't need Rockefeller's confession. The documentary evidence was damning enough. Internal Standard Oil correspondence revealed explicit discussions of eliminating competitors through coordinated pricing strategies. Railroad executives testified that Standard Oil had demanded and received rates unavailable to any other company. Former Standard Oil employees, speaking anonymously out of fear of retaliation, described a corporate culture where destroying competition was not just accepted, but expected, where executives were rewarded for driving independence out of business. One particularly devastating piece of evidence was a letter written in 1881 by John D. Archbold, one of Standard Oil's top executives, to a railroad official. "We are glad to be advised at any time when any of our competitors are preparing to build and increase their capacity, or make shipments. The information will be held in strict confidence and will enable us to forestall any injurious competition." The letter proved coordination between Standard Oil and the railroads to spy on competitors, a clear violation of fair trade practices. The trial stretched across 3 years, with motions, appeals, and endless procedural maneuvering by Standard Oil's legal team. But on November 20th, 1909, Judge Landis issued his ruling. Standard Oil was guilty of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act through systematic restraint of trade and monopolistic practices. The company was fined $29,240,000, the largest corporate fine in American history to that point, and ordered to dissolve its trust structure. Standard Oil immediately appealed to the United States Supreme Court, where the case would be argued over the course of 18 months. The company's lawyers made sophisticated constitutional arguments that the Sherman Act was too vague to be enforced, that interstate commerce required large-scale organization, that states couldn't regulate individually, that dissolving Standard Oil would harm American economic interests and benefit foreign competitors,
The government countered that no company, regardless of its contributions to economic efficiency, could be allowed to exist above the law, and that Standard Oil's history of predatory practices proved it had achieved monopoly through illegal means rather than superior service. On May 15, 1911, Chief Justice Edward Douglas White delivered the Supreme Court's decision. The ruling was 8-1 in favor of the government. The court found that Standard Oil had engaged in unreasonable restraint of trade, the key word being unreasonable, which would establish the rule of reason doctrine in antitrust law, allowing for large corporations as long as their practices weren't explicitly predatory. But in Standard Oil's case, the predatory nature was undeniable. The court ordered the company dissolved into 34 independent entities within 6 months.
The date set for dissolution was December 15, 1911. On that day, the largest corporate empire in American history was legally fractured. Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of California, Standard Oil of Indiana. Each became nominally independent, required to compete against each other in an open market. It was supposed to be the death of monopoly, proof that no company was above American law, vindication for every small businessman Rockefeller had destroyed on his path to dominance. But here is where the story takes its most ironic turn, revealing something profound about the nature of concentrated wealth and power. The dissolution made John D. Rockefeller richer than he had ever been. Under the trust structure, he owned approximately 27% of Standard Oil stock. When the company was broken into 34 pieces, he owned 27% of each piece. And those pieces, freed from the stigma of monopoly and able to operate more efficiently as specialized regional entities, actually increased in value. Within 2 years, Rockefeller's net worth had nearly doubled. By 1913, he was worth approximately $900 million, equivalent to over $400 billion in today's money, making him arguably the wealthiest individual in modern history. The companies created by Standard Oil's dissolution would dominate the 20th century. Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, BP America, all descendants of Rockefeller's empire. When ExxonMobil merged in 1999, it was essentially a reunion of 2 of the largest fragments of the original monopoly. The octopus had been cut into pieces, but each piece grew back, and some eventually merged again. The empire had been dismantled legally, but not economically. Its power had been diffused, but not destroyed. Rockefeller himself seemed unbothered by the trial and its outcome. By 1911, he had already begun his transition from active businessman to full-time philanthropist, though his version of retirement still involved controlling how hundreds of millions of dollars would be distributed. He spent his remaining years at his estate in Pocantico Hills, New York, playing golf, attending church, and cultivating the image of a benevolent patriarch. When asked about the antitrust case in a rare interview, he responded with characteristic detachment. "The Supreme Court has spoken. I respect the decision. My conscience is clear. I built an industry and served the public well. History will be my judge."
But history is written by those who remember what was lost, not just what was gained. And the question that haunted America in the aftermath of the Standard Oil case was whether the outcome represented justice or merely the illusion of justice. The monopoly had been broken legally, but the man who built it had been rewarded beyond measure. The system had been reformed, but the wealth accumulated through decades of predatory practices remained in the hands of those who had accumulated it. And the model Rockefeller pioneered, vertical integration, systematic elimination of competition, capture of political and regulatory systems, would be studied and replicated by every ambitious corporation that followed. The trial had proven that even the most powerful monopoly could be challenged when public opinion demanded it and government found the will to act. But it had also proven something darker, that by the time monopoly is broken, the damage has already been done, the wealth has already been concentrated, and those who broke the rules have often positioned themselves beyond the reach of meaningful punishment. John D. Rockefeller would die wealthy and respected, his reputation rehabilitated by decades of strategic philanthropy. His victims would die forgotten, their names erased from history, their struggles reduced to footnotes in the story of American progress. The question remained, who was John D. Rockefeller really? The answer, as with all complex men, depended on who you asked and what you chose to remember.
In his final years, John D. Rockefeller became a puzzle wrapped in contradictions. A man whose public image and private reality seemed to exist in parallel universes that never quite touched. He woke each morning at dawn, as he had for 70 years. But now, instead of reviewing refinery reports, he read his Bible and planned his charitable donations with the same meticulous attention he had once devoted to destroying competitors. The transformation was so complete that many Americans, particularly younger generations who hadn't lived through Standard Oil's predatory heyday, saw him only as a generous old man who had pledged to give away his fortune before he died. And give it away he did, on a scale that had never been attempted. In 1913, he established the Rockefeller Foundation with an initial endowment of $250 million, more than $3 billion in today's money. The foundation's mission was sweeping: to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. It funded medical research that led to treatments for hookworm, yellow fever, and malaria. It supported scientific research at universities across America and Europe. It built schools in the rural South, both for Black and white students, at a time when such integration was revolutionary. By the time of Rockefeller's death, the foundation had improved or saved millions of lives globally. The University of Chicago, which Rockefeller had founded in 1890, became one of the world's great research institutions, producing more Nobel Prize winners than nearly any other American university. Rockefeller gave the school over $80 million during his lifetime, always with strict conditions about academic freedom and quality standards. When asked why he gave so generously to education, he replied with words that could be interpreted as either noble or chilling. "I believe in the supreme worth of the individual and in his right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I believe that every right implies a responsibility, every opportunity an obligation, every possession a duty." But those pretty words existed alongside ugly realities.
In 1914, a labor dispute at a Colorado coal mine owned by Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, in which Rockefeller held a controlling interest through family investments, exploded into violence. Miners, demanding better wages and working conditions, had been on strike for months. On April 20th, the Colorado National Guard and company security forces attacked a tent colony of striking miners and their families in Ludlow. The assault turned into a massacre. Guards fired machine guns into the tents, then set them ablaze. 21 people died, including 11 children who suffocated in a pit they had dug beneath their tent trying to escape the flames. The Ludlow massacre became a national scandal. Newspapers published photographs of the burned bodies, of weeping widows, of children's small corpses lined up in rows. Labor leaders and progressive politicians demanded that Rockefeller, as the primary shareholder, be held accountable. His initial response was defensive. He claimed to have no knowledge of conditions in Colorado, insisted he didn't interfere in operational management, and suggested that the blame lay with radical union organizers who had incited violence. It was the same playbook he had used during the Antitrust trial: claim ignorance, delegate responsibility, and remain above the fray.
But the public wasn't buying it anymore. This wasn't abstract business competition, it was dead children. Protesters gathered outside Rockefeller's offices and home. Newspapers ran editorials with headlines like "Rockefeller's Dead Babies" and "The Blood-Stained Millions." For perhaps the first time in his life, John D. Rockefeller faced consequences that money and lawyers couldn't immediately fix. His reputation, carefully cultivated through decades of strategic philanthropy, was crumbling. Enter Ivy Ledbetter Lee, the man who would invent modern public relations. Lee was a former journalist who had pioneered the concept of corporate crisis management. Rockefeller hired him to repair his image, and Lee understood that denial wouldn't work. Instead, he orchestrated a carefully planned rehabilitation campaign. He convinced Rockefeller to visit Colorado personally, to tour the mining camps, to be photographed talking with miners and their families, to express regret for the tragedy without quite admitting culpability. He arranged for newsreel cameras to capture Rockefeller looking sympathetic and grandfatherly, a far cry from the cold-eyed monopolist of public imagination. The campaign worked, partially because Lee was brilliant, and partially because the public wanted to believe that the benevolent philanthropist was Rockefeller's true self, and the ruthless businessman had been an aberration of youth. But those who had studied Rockefeller closely knew better. The man was coherent, not contradictory. His generosity and his cruelty came from the same source: an absolute belief in his right to control, to organize, to decide what was best. He gave away hundreds of millions because he believed he knew better than anyone else how that money should be used. He had destroyed competitors because he believed economic efficiency justified any means. He funded schools and hospitals because he saw human beings as resources to be improved, just as he had seen oil refineries as operations to be optimized. One of Rockefeller's own granddaughters, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, once said in a private conversation that was later leaked to biographers, "Grandfather believed he was doing God's work, always. Whether he was negotiating a railroad rebate or endowing a college, he saw himself as an instrument of divine providence, bringing order to chaos." The scary thing wasn't that he was a hypocrite. It was that he genuinely saw no contradiction between his business practices and his faith. As Rockefeller aged, his daily routine became ritualized to the point of obsession.
He woke at 6, read scripture, ate a breakfast of milk and bread, the same meal he had eaten as a poor boy in Cleveland. He played golf with a precision that annoyed his partners, counting every stroke, calculating every advantage. He gave out shiny new dimes to children and strangers, a gesture that began as spontaneous generosity, but became so publicized that it seemed calculated, which, of course, it was. Everything Rockefeller did was calculated. That was his nature.
His relationship with his children and grandchildren revealed another layer of complexity. He was demanding, expecting them to maintain the family's reputation and continue its philanthropic work. He established trust funds with strict conditions about how the money could be used, maintaining control from beyond the grave. But he was also capable of genuine affection, writing long letters to his grandchildren filled with advice about character and responsibility. When his granddaughter asked him once what he wanted his legacy to be, he reportedly responded, "I want to be remembered as a man who made the world more efficient and then used his wealth to make it better. Whether people like how I made the money matters less than what I did with it." But of course, it did matter. It mattered to George Rice and the hundreds of other independent oil men whose businesses and lives Rockefeller had destroyed. It mattered to the workers in his refineries who earned subsistence wages while he accumulated unprecedented wealth. It mattered to the miners' families in Ludlow. The efficiency he created had come at enormous human cost, and the philanthropy he practiced was funded by practices that would be considered illegal and immoral by later standards. By the 1930s, Rockefeller had outlived most of his generation. Andrew Carnegie was dead. J.P. Morgan was dead. Most of the men he had competed against or collaborated with were gone. He remained an artifact from another era, living in his mansion, surrounded by nurses and attendants, still counting his money, still making decisions about where his remaining millions would go. On May 23, 1937, at the age of 97, John Davison Rockefeller died of arteriosclerosis at his home in Ormond Beach, Florida. His funeral at the Euclid Avenue Baptist Church in Cleveland was attended by thousands, many of whom had benefited from his philanthropy and genuinely mourned the passing of a great man. The obituaries were mixed. Some praised him as an industrial pioneer who had organized the chaotic oil industry and created efficiencies that benefited consumers globally. Others condemned him as a robber baron who had broken laws, destroyed lives, and accumulated wealth through predatory practices. Both were true. The paradox of John D. Rockefeller was that he contained multitudes, brilliant and ruthless, generous and cruel, visionary and destructive. He was America in microcosm, capable of remarkable achievement built on morally compromised foundations, forever wrestling with the question of whether the ends justified the means. His estate was valued at approximately $26 million at death, a fraction of his peak wealth, as he had systematically given away over $500 million during his lifetime. But his true legacy couldn't be measured in dollars.
It existed in the institutions he had founded, in the corporate structures he had pioneered, in the very definition of American capitalism that he had helped create. For better and worse, the modern world bore his fingerprints.
The year is 2025, and if you drive a car today, you likely filled it with gasoline from a company that traces its lineage directly to Standard Oil. ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, the giants of the petroleum industry, are all children and grandchildren of the empire John D. Rockefeller built. When you fill your tank, a fraction of every dollar you spend echoes a business model perfected in the 1870s. Vertical integration, control of supply chains, and economies of scale that make competition nearly impossible. The octopus was dismembered, but its tentacles grew back. But Rockefeller's legacy extends far beyond petroleum. The Rockefeller family became an American dynasty that shaped politics, art, and culture for over a century. Nelson Rockefeller served as vice president under Gerald Ford. David Rockefeller was chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank and an influential figure in international finance until his death in 2017 at age 101. J. Rockefeller represented West Virginia in the U.S. Senate for 30 years. The family's philanthropic foundations continue to distribute millions annually to causes ranging from environmental conservation to medical research to the arts. The Rockefeller University, founded in 1891 as the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, has produced 37 Nobel Prize winners. The research conducted there contributed to understanding viruses, developing antibiotics, and mapping the human genome. The University of Chicago, which Rockefeller essentially created, ranks among the world's top 10 universities and has produced 94 Nobel laureates. These institutions have improved countless lives, advanced human knowledge, and trained generations of scientists and scholars. This is inarguably positive legacy. But here is the uncomfortable question that historians still debate. Does transformative philanthropy erase predatory capitalism? Can generosity in old age redeem ruthlessness in youth? The money that built those universities and funded that research came from practices that destroyed competitors, exploited workers, and corrupted the political process. If you cure a disease with money earned by ruining thousands of lives, what is the moral calculus? How do we balance the equation? Modern America wrestles with this question constantly because John D. Rockefeller's template didn't die with Standard Oil. It evolved. Today, we call them tech giants instead of robber barons, but the pattern is eerily similar. Amazon controls such a dominant share of online retail that independent sellers are forced to use its platform, even as Amazon uses their sales data to launch competing products. Google's search engine is so dominant that Google it became a verb, and the company faces antitrust investigations for allegedly using that dominance to favor its own services. Facebook, now Meta, acquired potential competitors, Instagram and WhatsApp, building a social media empire that critics say has too much power over information flow and too little accountability for the social damage its algorithms cause. The arguments sound familiar. These companies claim they succeeded through innovation and better service.
Critics say they achieved dominance through anti-competitive practices, crushing rivals, and exploiting network effects that make competition impossible once a certain scale is reached. The debates in Congress today about breaking up big tech echo the debates from 1906 about breaking up Standard Oil. We are living through a second Gilded Age, where wealth inequality has reached levels not seen since Rockefeller's time, where a handful of billionaires control more wealth than half of humanity combined, where corporate power seems to exceed democratic accountability. The lesson of Standard Oil is not that monopolies can't be broken. They can. The Supreme Court proved that in 1911. The lesson is that breaking monopolies is enormously difficult, requires sustained public pressure and political will, usually comes too late to undo the damage, and often rewards the monopolists themselves. Rockefeller died wealthy and respected. The companies created from Standard Oil's dissolution became some of the most profitable corporations in history. The victims of his predatory practices died mostly poor and forgotten.
So, what do we conclude about John D. Rockefeller? Was he a genius businessman who organized chaos into efficiency and then redeemed himself through unprecedented philanthropy? Or was he a corporate criminal who broke laws systematically, destroyed lives without remorse, and used charity to launder his reputation? The answer depends partly on your values and partly on which aspects of his life you choose to emphasize. But perhaps the real answer is that he was both simultaneously. A man who contained within himself the contradictions of capitalism itself. American capitalism rewards efficiency and innovation, but it also rewards ruthlessness and concentration of power. It creates enormous wealth that can be used for tremendous good, but it often creates that wealth through practices that harm workers, consumers, and competitors. It promises opportunity, but tends toward monopoly. It celebrates individual achievement, but creates dynastic wealth that persists across generations regardless of merit. John D. Rockefeller embodied all of these contradictions perfectly. He was capitalism's greatest success story and its most damning indictment rolled into one human life. The universities he founded will educate students for centuries. The foundations bearing his name will continue funding research and social programs long after everyone reading this is dead. These are real, lasting contributions to human welfare. But they exist alongside the real, lasting damage of a business model that normalized the destruction of competition and the subordination of human welfare to profit maximization. Both legacies are true. Both must be remembered. And perhaps the most important lesson is that we should be suspicious of anyone who tries to tell only one side of the story. When you read about billionaires pledging to give away their fortunes, remember that philanthropy can coexist with predatory business practices. When you hear corporations claim they're too big to be broken up without harming the economy, remember that Standard Oil made the same argument, and the economy survived its dissolution just fine. When politicians tell you that regulations hurt innovation, remember that Standard Oil innovated remarkably while also systematically destroying competition through illegal means. The questions are not simple,
And anyone who tells you they are is either ignorant or selling something. John D. Rockefeller died nearly 90 years ago, but his ghost haunts every antitrust hearing, every debate about corporate regulation, every discussion of wealth inequality. We live in the world he helped create, for better and worse. And the question facing us now is the same question that faced America in 1906. What do we do about concentrated power that exists within the law but against the spirit of democratic capitalism? Do we accept it as the natural result of market competition? Or do we regulate it as a threat to economic freedom and political democracy? Rockefeller would tell you that he brought order to chaos, efficiency to waste, and then gave back more than he took. His victims would tell you that he was a predator who destroyed lives and bought his way to respectability. History suggests both are true, and that the tension between these truths is what makes his story enduringly relevant. We admire achievement, but we fear power. We respect wealth creation, but we resent exploitation. We want efficiency, but we value competition. We celebrate philanthropy, but we question its sufficiency as redemption. John D. Rockefeller was not simply good or evil. He was human, which means he was capable of both, sometimes simultaneously. The empire he built changed the world. The methods he used damaged it. The wealth he gave away helped millions. The wealth he accumulated came from thousands. And 100 years later, we're still arguing about whether it all added up to progress or just dressed exploitation in a nicer suit. That is his legacy, not certainty, but questions. Questions we still haven't answered. Questions that matter more now than ever.
If you've made it this far, you've just experienced the complete rise and fall of the most powerful monopoly in American history. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Was John D. Rockefeller a visionary genius who revolutionized industry and gave back more than he took? Or was he a corporate criminal whose philanthropy was just an elaborate PR campaign to whitewash decades of predatory capitalism? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and be honest, because this debate has been raging for over a century, and we're nowhere near resolving it. If you found this documentary valuable, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden histories that shaped the modern world. Give this video a like if you think more people need to understand the complicated truth behind the legends we're taught. And share it with someone who needs to know that the past is never as simple as we pretend it is. Thanks for watching. History isn't just about what happened, it's about what we learn from it, or fail to learn. See you in the next one.